Welcome back to Fresh Economic Thinking. You're with Cameron Murray. Today, a special guest, a friend of mine from online, Robert Lichty. I'll have to get that surname correct, who says he's an average guy with a job, but I think he's more than that. He's got some very interesting ideas about superannuation, helmet laws, a lot of the topics that really interest me today. So, Robert, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Cam. Good to be on.
Yeah, so maybe we should start. You've just told me you're an average bloke. What sort of got you into political commentary? Because that's how we sort of cross paths online. How does one go these days from average guy into thoughtful political commentator?
Well, thoughtful's a strong word, but I guess I've always had a fascination with how people form their opinions, how they arrive at the views that they do, and how that's formed. Um, and so I've always been interested in topics where I think the conventional wisdom is clearly really strange and really wrong.
Mm.
So superannuation and bike helmets, which I think people who follow me online will know two of my hobby horses. I think those are both things where people's views are just quite bizarre and inconsistent. And so I'm kind of fascinated by how people arrive at those views and have those views in contradiction to a lot of other things that they possibly believe or say that they believe.
That was a great summary. I think, yeah, I if I was going to describe your thoughts on things, it's really like pointing out some absurdities or inconsistencies on what are fairly basic or mundane topics, really, at the end of the day. So why don't we start with the one that a lot of people get really heated about, which is bicycle helmet laws. And I know people get heated because if I ride without a bicycle helmet down the street, people will yell from their car at me. What do we get wrong there? Where is our basic intuition that Aussies seem to hold dear? What's wrong with it?
Well, I mean, to start with, a pace to remember with helmet law is that Australia is completely unique globally in terms of our helmet laws. I think most Australians think that they're just kind of common sense and like absolute no-brainer kind of safety regulations, similar to, seatbelts in cars. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but of course, many countries around the world have seatbelt laws in cars. I'd say most do. But in terms of helmet laws, I think there's about four countries which have, nationally enforced helmet laws for all public places. And of those, I think it's New Zealand, Australia, Argentina. Of those, Australia is completely unique in terms of the severity of them, in terms of the fine amount, and also how strictly they're enforced and how seriously they're taken. So I think New Zealand is actually sort of second most severe in terms of helmet law enforcement, and the fine there is at last count I think it was $60. Compared to here, which is I think in Victoria, high 200s, mid 300s in New South Wales. I'm not sure about Queensland, but and Victoria's even gone more extreme with scooters. So scooter helmets are I think $395 for not wearing a helmet on a scooter, and I think it's like 600 and yeah, mid 600s if you're a passenger on a scooter and you're not wearing a helmet. So those fines are just way, way, way out of line compared to anywhere else. And I think it's interesting to look at what the reasons for that are. I mean, obviously
Mm-hmm.
the justification is safety. If you ask most people, that'll be their one word answer on why we have these helmet laws. But in fact, if you look at bike safety, if you look at road safety in general, we're not actually much safer than elsewhere. If you look at the Netherlands, which has much more people on bikes, no helmet law, famously, low level of compliance with helmet wearing. Their per capita road toll is, uh, much less than ours. And so, what are these laws actually for?
Yeah, tell me. So I do find that the history is very odd, right, with helmet laws. I remember the stack hats when I was a kid. It was a big deal, and my parents were really into it. And so it wasn't until I sort of traveled to Europe and realized everyone doesn't wear helmets. And in fact, every Aussie who gets off the plane immediately forgets all the logic that they thought they had in their brain, right, for why they should wear a helmet. They just forget it as soon as they touch down in a country where it's not the law. So I do find that interesting. Do you know much about the history of the implementation? Because if I understand, it was a kind of deal. The feds required all the states to enforce a law as some kind of political bargain. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think so. So I think it kicked off sort of late 80s, early 90s, and it was sort of the era where I think seatbelts were also getting made mandatory. So it was, if you look at it in the context of that happening, it didn't come out of the blue. Um, it came along with people dying in a transport context and uh, in large numbers more generally, and so that's where it came from.
Mm,
Um, but it was the Australasian College of Surgeons, I think they're called, who uh, started lobbying actively for it and kind of took off from there. The origin story is a little bit different in New Zealand. In New Zealand, there was a woman there who campaigned quite vigorously for it after her child sadly died in a road accident, and
mhm,
apparently, immediately after that, on the day it had happened, a doctor at the hospital said, "Oh, if your child had been wearing a helmet, then they probably would have survived." And obviously, this really
mm,
awakened this within her as a cause. Um, for whatever reason, she didn't blame the driver of the car. She blamed the helmet instead. But that's how it kind of took off there. So different stories in different places, but it seems to be these two countries, which is where it took off.
So I'm going to have to, because I'm sure a lot of listeners think helmet laws are still normal and fine. And even if we're the only ones in the world, then it must be because we're the best. And therefore only we have the best laws. What's wrong with them? Like, surely it's, if it's common sense, then just requiring people to do what's common sense seems okay. What's the best argument against them?
Well, I think the fundamental problem is that when you have extremely harsh mandatory helmet laws, like we do in this country, I mean, and New Zealand obviously has them as well, but it's kind of by the by because enforcement is lower and like we just mentioned, fines are lower, right? But
Mhm.
when you have them so strictly enforced and taken so seriously, you essentially criminalize uh, the act of cycling to a large degree. You make it more inconvenient, you stigmatize it, and that pushes people into other modes of transport, right, by discouraging cycling. And so, what mode of transport are people going to use if they don't use a bicycle? They're going to jump into their cars. If they jump into their cars more often, they're going to have more crashes. So the more car journeys, the more crashes, uh, generally speaking. And so uh, there's going to be more crashes, more head injuries from car crashes, but also more cars are going to hit cyclists. And so not only are there going to be more car crashes, there's going to be more cars hitting cyclists. And of course, when a car hits a cyclist, that's a helmet is not really doing much.
Yeah, I do find it. Um, I had a bit of a deep dive into helmets when I came back from a trip to Europe and thought I didn't have a helmet but I had a bike. So I'm like, oh, better just go down the shop. Like, it's not a weird thing. But apparently, yeah, in Australia, it is. I guess I then read some studies, and I'm not sure if you're familiar. There's one where uh, people dress up on a bike, like in a dress and a blonde wig, and they ride along and they measure. They have a device measuring how close the cars pass them, and then they wear a suit and then they wear a helmet. And it turns out that if you're in active wear wearing a helmet, cars will actually go much closer to you when they pass you than if you're have a blonde wig and a dress on. They'll give you a lot more room when they go around you. So that's the sort of classic economic lesson that there's countervailing forces. You make the cyclist look really safe, then the driver gives them less space. Is there any other sort of research you've read on the topic that sort of demonstrates some of those non-intuitive outcomes to what seems at first blush to be a sensible safety law for most Aussies?
Yeah, I mean, there's a fair amount of studies like that. There's plenty that show that the more safety equipment you're wearing, the closer cars will pass to you, because by wearing high vis and a helmet and all the rest, um, you're sort of portraying yourself to your surroundings as if you're engaged in some inherently dangerous activity, right? So people feel
Hmm.
less need to give you less respect because you're kind of acknowledging that you're doing a dangerous thing. And so it's kind of like when there's painted bike lanes, that can actually be worse for safety because instead of people seeing a bike and going, "Oh, I better give this guy a lot of room because I'm in a big car," they go, "Oh, well, he stays in his lane, I stay in my lane. As long as I do that, I can pass as close as I want. No
Yeah.
worries."
Yeah.
So
So would you say then that overall helmet laws are one of those policies that seem intuitive, but probably lead to more deaths on the road because we have fewer cyclists and more drivers, and driving is inherently dangerous, and more drivers and less cyclists make the remaining cyclists more in danger? Is that sort of the general thesis? And is there research that sort of points in that direction?
Yeah, so it's very much a cultural thing and a safety and numbers thing. When there's lots of bikes on the road, and when enough of the population bikes at least occasionally to build some empathy with people on bikes, people are
Mm,
obviously it means less cars on the road, but it also means uh, bikes are going to get much more respected, right?
mm,
And so I'm I think the clearest example of how the behavioural change works is probably bike share schemes. The Melbourne scheme is famous for uh, basically failing because before you used a bike, you had to go off and find a helmet from somewhere. I think initially when they launched, they kind of expected people to just bring a helmet with them all
yeah.
day in case they hadn't get a bike, which is obviously incredibly inconvenient. Um, and later they started adding them to some of the bikes and also offering them at convenience stores. But obviously the friction is just so high. Like nobody wants to have to go off on a side quest to find a helmet just to take a 5 minute bike ride. So it's kind of obvious how it failed, but you think what are the consequences of a scheme like that failing, right? Like
Yeah.
obviously people are just going to jump in more Ubers instead. If a city goes from having a thriving bike share scheme to having none because of these laws, the result of that change is much less bikes, but more cars on the road, more Ubers, and
Mm,
obviously the bigger problem is when you have less numbers of cyclists, less numbers riding on a bike, you have a less powerful constituency, right? And
yeah.
so when people are pushed to the side, then there's no bikes on the road. When there's no bikes on the road, then there's no reason to install bike lanes. There's no reason to cater for cycle safety at all, really, because they're this extremely niche minority who are not worth caring about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to note that not mandating bike helmets doesn't mean you're not allowed to wear one. A lot of people think, oh, if you don't mandate it, um, what if I get hit by a car? And I say, well, you're allowed to wear one if you think that's a good thing, right? Not mandating it does not mean you can't voluntarily do it. Just like we don't mandate safety goggles and earplugs when you're mowing the lawn, it's still your choice, right? And people don't wear helmets driving cars, so you can kind of see the risks they want to take. Whereas if you're in a race car doing similar speeds to what you do on the highway, oh, you wear a 5 point harness, a fireproof outfit, and a full face helmet, right? I find that very strange.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a personal choice thing, and there's lots of things that we do which can be dangerous, can result in quite a few deaths per year. Going outside without wearing sunscreen, going for a swim at the beach. Many people drown each year, and
Yeah.
even in terms of falls onto hard surfaces, which is the main thing a helmet protects you from. Obviously, like falls at home are the
Mm,
most common way that elderly people die, if I remember correctly. So it's there's you know there's all these dangerous things that people do because life inherently just contains these
mhm.
these these dangerous situations, and preventing all risk is impossible. And if we want to if we want to have a society where we all walk around in protective gear at all times and make that mandatory, then people can make that's an argument that you can make, but it can't be selective. You can't say, oh, just this one particular scenario, we've got to have an incredibly punitive legal framework around, but
Yeah.
all these others we're just going to accept. Like that's completely inconsistent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the basic argument against helmet laws is saying, well, people die from hitting their head on the windscreen in car crashes. Should we also require helmets in cars? And immediately everyone will switch their tune and go, oh, yeah, but it's not as dangerous. And well, actually, it kind of is. Oh, yeah, but. So it sounds like helmet laws, one of those places, as you said at the top, where common sense just is inconsistent with common sense in any other circumstance. Tell me about school lunches then, because this is another one of those topics I've seen you comment on. And just yesterday, the Queensland Premier announced primary school kids will get school lunch at school. Why is this controversial in your view? What's what's going on?
It's a strange one, isn't it? Because if you look at public education system, the way that's funded is that the government takes care of the costs of almost every aspect of it already, right? Like
Hmm.
they pay for the buildings, they pay for the teachers, they pay for pretty much every aspect of the experience once you drop your kid off at the gate. But lunch is somehow different, and why should it really be different? Like if the government's funding 99% of the school day experience, why not 100? And there's obvious efficiency gains from it, like everyone buying individually packaged muesli bars, fruit, individually packing them at home each morning, taking them, individually buying lunch boxes, taking them to school, like all, all those individual actions and labor and costs and plastic packaging. Obviously there's huge efficiency gains to just you know cooking up a big cauldron of chili at the school, right? Like it, it's just a no-brainer in terms of saving parents time, efficiency, and why not? But there's this whole, you get the opposition from the right where they're like, why should my taxes pay for anything at all? And then you get the opposition from the left, which is like, oh, but what if a rich kid at the school gets a free sandwich? Wouldn't that be terrible? That's a handout for rich kid. And so it's this whole from the left, it's this whole sort of means testing brain where you have to you can't do good things in case a rich person maybe benefits, right?
Yeah, even though they can drive on the roads, use the parks, the nicest parks, schools, very keen on public schools, but then not keen on the lunch in the public school. That would be the left position. The left critique is that parks are okay, roads are okay, school is okay, the meal at school not okay. Is that that's
Yeah, well, I mean, I think on the left, more and more people on the left are in favor of universalism and getting to understand that means testing is just doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's not really saving anything. Like all you're doing is adding administrative burden. Like if you did school lunches, but then you made some complex eligibility process where only poor kids could get it, then you're stigmatizing the lunches because all the kids are going to get teased for being the poor kids who have to have school lunch, but
yeah,
you're also creating admin burden, and all to just avoid a rich kid getting a free sandwich at school. And obviously, like the truly elite rich kids are going to be going to private school anyway, right? Like
yeah.
this is public school, so
Yeah, I
uh,
mean, I think it's 60 something percent of high school kids go to public schools and 75% of primary school kids anyway. So it really is the vast majority. So yeah, that's a strange one. I was really shocked after that Queensland announcement that the right wing is so upset about school lunches and the cost of them, yet at the same time is super keen on nuclear submarines and like the orders of magnitude of the cost just seem to drop away. right? If we can label something a cost, it is therefore bad. It doesn't matter if it's $1 million or $1 billion. If we can label it as a benefit, it doesn't matter, if it cost $1 million or $1 billion. Do you think that's sort of woven into this? Because I want to ask you also about public transport fares. I know you comment on that, and that's another area where common sense goes out the window. Do you think it's just I can't get to the bottom of it. Do you have any sort of psychological insight into how people fall politically?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Means testing is just this kind of centrist. It's this kind of centrist thing, right? Because if you're on the right, you don't want the government giving anyone anything. If you're on the left, then you're kind of pro this expansive view of the welfare state. But for I think for sort of centrist types, it's like um, means testing is great because it means you can sort of look like you're doing something, but actually kind of add so much admin burden and complexity that you can really constrain the spending of it. Um,
Hmm.
and and it also and because means testing has this feature built into it where it's effectively like a head tax, right? Like if your means tested the pension, it's effectively like a tax where the
Yeah,
most you can ever be taxed is the pension, right? So if you're a billionaire and you're taxed an extra 10%, that's a lot of money for you. But if you're means tested and you lose the pension, like who cares about that? That's
yeah,
change under the carrot, right? And so means testing becomes this. It's essentially slugging the middle class with a particular kind of tax while letting those at the very top kind of get away scot-free. And so if you apply that to public transport fares, it's kind of the same thing, right? So instead of just building a really cool city with a great transport system where you can just jump on, jump off, and you make it so ubiquitous and cheap that everyone can just get around really easily and doesn't need to have a car.
hmm,
Um, Instead, you can cut transport, not spend very much, and cut it even further by charging charging these fares, right? And so instead of just having good stuff funded by progressive taxation, you kind of you constrain the spending on that, and then you claw it back through public transport fares. And so instead of just taxing the money, you're you're actually slugging in the public transport case. It's most egregious of all because you're actually slugging people who are using efficient and environmentally sustainable forms of transport, right? So yeah, instead of building an efficient transport system, it's about cutting spending on transport to as little as politically possible, and then cutting it even further by imposing this effective tax on sustainable transport usage.
so can I think I'm with you. So Queensland introduced this 50-cent fares a month or so ago, and everyone I talk to seems to love it, right? Because it used to cost $20 for me to take my family on the bus just down the road and back, right? A few kilometers. And so driving was way cheaper. And now it costs at most $4. And so I definitely see people liking it. But the argument against it would be that if you don't charge based on user pays, where is the incentive for the management of the public transport system to respond to the demands of the users and invest where that demand is higher? Can't they just do whatever their pet projects are that they think look nice and ignore sort of the real demands of the people for getting around? Like, isn't there that really nice feedback that we get in markets by pricing the user pays? What would be your response to that?
Well, I think my response to that is that's getting cause and effect backwards, right? Because the whole the whole thing of transport is that we have this concept of induced demand that people learn about, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
the more you build services, if you build a highway, then suddenly all these people appear to use the highway and move to the other end of the highway and drive back down the highway, right? And so it's not really that we have demand and then we build infrastructure to meet it. It's that we build infrastructure and then the demand appears, right? So, um, like,
Yeah, I mean, I can
and
buy that to a degree, but there's lots of like white elephant roads and rail projects that sort of go nowhere, some would argue. Um, and if you're relying on more user pays, then those projects wouldn't have been built and other ones would have. What do you think that's going to be true in user pays anyway?
Yeah, I mean, there's still, even though we have public transport fares, we still seem to have, white elephant public transport projects, and we tend to get we tend to get planning driven by the likes of Transurban, or the need to. A lot of the criticism of the suburban rail loop in Victoria is that it runs through swing seats and that it's too far out because it's in these sort of outer suburban swing seats, rather than where population density is highest or where it should be highest, right? And so we get back to
Yeah.
this thing of where do you want the population density to be highest? You probably want to build lots of rail infrastructure in the inner city or in the inner ring so that people can live low car lifestyles there, get around by public transport easier there. And if you're
Hmm.
going to have good density somewhere, then you want to have it in these higher density places where that kind of walkable lower car life is possible, right? And so in terms of like I think it's inevitable with transport, particularly something large scale like trains. Like
Yeah.
you have to like master planning is inevitable, right? You can't
Very
just
true.
go, oh, we'll let the market decide where the train stations go. Like at the end of the day, you need someone's got to be like, okay, we're going to have more stuff here and less stuff there, right? Like that's just the nature of city building.
Yeah. So your point is we're already sort of deciding on transport investments politically anyway, and whether we pay for fares or not, it's not really changing that underlying requirement to master plan major public works. And again, I think the logic, to go back to our theme of the common sense sort of missing from these debates, if we said roads must be user pays and cost recovery on a per kilometer basis, like transport fares, people would flip out, don't you think? If every road had an electronic toll, or there was a 12 zone ring system on the road network where everyone had to pay a fare, and if they got a return trip, on the roads in the evenings, it would be a discount, or if you have more than 10 trips in a week, you get to drive on the weekend for free. I think people would go nuts and say it's the most ridiculous system ever. Do you think so?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think people wouldn't put up with the indignity that they put up with public transport for cars, right?
Yeah.
Like in a lot of Australian cities, once your kid turns 5, they need to have their own public transport card, right? So family of 4 goes out for the day on the train, and you need to manage 4 cards. Like no one would put up with having 4 swipe cards in their car to manage uh,
Driving.
every time they took the car out or something, right? But I think there's this problem, underappreciated problem happening right now with the
Mhm.
way cars work and with the shift to electric vehicles, where because of the nature of the way electric vehicles get charged, they can be effectively charged for free a lot of the time, right? Like there's
Yeah.
free charging networks, and there's chargers that will charge adaptively based on when you have an excess of power coming off the
Hmm.
panels on your roof, right? So we're getting to the point with cars now where, although the fixed costs of a car are quite high, like buying a new EV is quite expensive, using them is going to be free, effectively free in terms of marginal costs. I mean, maybe there's some maintenance going on, but we can think of it as more or less free per kilometer to use an electric car.
Hmm.
And so you compare that to public transport, and particularly the type of fare you were talking about before with your family, where like it costs $20 to go down the road on the bus. Suddenly you're at the point where going on the bus is the luxury option and the car is the cheap option. And
Yeah.
that's obviously, if you want a city where public transport works well and is widely used and is ubiquitous, and where you don't need to drive everywhere and have freeways running everywhere and cross busy roads to get where you want to go. That's what I want, because I think that's more efficient, and I think it's nicer to walk around when cities are like that. Then the situation with marginal costs of cars is a total disaster, right? Because and PT is going to become this sort of niche luxury option. Fewer and fewer people are going to use it, and then that totally undermines the demand for building more, the political cause for building more, because
Yep.
uh, it's suddenly it's this luxury thing which only trained nerds and people with a lot of free time and money use, instead of being this kind of everyday thing, right?
Yeah. No, I can definitely see that happening. And I almost think about that when I think, what's should I wait for an electric car to get cheaper? Because then all these short trips will essentially be free, right? Like either off-peak charging or solar charging. Um, but you're right. Um, I do find it interesting how much people like these policies. Um, the uh, the 50-cent fares in Queensland, the proposal to um, include school lunches, all these nice things. I find it interesting, though, when we get to one of your other topics, superannuation, that people really seem to like superannuation from across the spectrum. And I've found almost no one, and maybe it's a bit like bike helmets, the people who think the rules are bad are just such a small group. But in superannuation, it's probably even smaller. Where is the where's on the theme of today, where is the sort of common sense failing us when it comes to superannuation, to sort of wrap it up with a final topic?
Super's funny, right? Because I think people don't think about it on a systematic level just very much at all, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, I think that's true of a lot of things. Like, most people are, for obvious reasons, just mostly thinking about their own lives and how to get by day to day. And you know, people who people who think about things systematically, like economists and nerds like me, they're kind of the minority, right? And
Hmm.
so people don't consider, people just see. If you ask someone to think about superannuation, they'll think, "Oh, okay, I got a couple of hundred grand there. If we abolished it, then I wouldn't have a couple of hundred grand there. I like having a couple of hundred grand in my account. Superannuation is good. That's it, right?" So
Hmm.
it's completely individual, and so people don't think about, oh, okay, well, if we have this fixed percentage of income that compounds, what's that going to do for inequality? People don't get that far. If they think, if we have an individualized saving system and people live different amounts of time, is that going to result in good retirement outcomes or not? Is that going to give people a secure income over their life, or will they run out? People just don't think that far ahead.
Right. So you're saying that they're actually in the case of super, taking that personal view, for example, like the family who's got two kids at primary school that's going to get free lunch next year. In that case, the personal view is kind of aligned with the collective view that, yeah, it's good for you. You get a free lunch, uh, literally. Um, and on super, it looks to you from an individual point of view that you're getting a free lunch, but from the collective, we're not. Can you maybe help me wrap my head around, or do you think I'm on the wrong track here with this way of thinking?
Yeah, I mean that sounds right. I think in both those cases, which they've done in Queensland, everyone loves a cheap fare. Everyone, as you say, everyone loves a free lunch, right? So it
Yeah.
works in that case. Super's different because it's like people think it's the system that gives them sort of free money. Which usually they don't think about at all, but then if they do, they realize it's this extra money that they suddenly have, right? So all the psychology is set up to favor this individual status quo, and so it works the other way. I think to really change super, you'd have to have a lot of you'd have to have a lot of campaigning around. Okay, here's why the security of a universal pension would be better for you. Here's the here's the much bigger pension we could have if we took all these tax breaks and all the wastage from fees and gave that to you directly instead of a pension. Here's why you wouldn't run out if we switch to a higher universal pension instead of super. So I don't think anyone is really talking about that.
Hmm.
Even Obviously Labor's never going to say anything against super. The Libs are the libs hate super, but from a right perspective, not a progressive perspective, not a universal welfare state perspective, and the Greens, I don't really think they have the voice to say much about it at all. Um, I think they're I think the Greens are definitely they've got a strong kind of universalist bent, but I think there's only a few issues that they get coverage on, and so they can't talk about it enough. So
Mm.
um, in terms of the political appetite for changing it, there's really no voices talking about that stuff, and so it becomes this really niche thing where it's only like wonks like us who kind of think about the
Yeah.
concept of social insurance, right? Um, where once you do think about it from the systematic perspective, you see all the inefficiencies. You see that it's not providing social insurance because it's like an insurance scheme uh, where the money isn't pooled, right? And the whole point of
Yeah.
insurance is pooling the risk. So yeah, there's just no good voices out there.
So I want to ask you then. Obviously, I've proposed scrapping super. I want to sort of ask what your thoughts are on what is better than super or how to go from here to a better place. But before I do, I just wanted to sort of revisit the theme of the lack of common sense applied or the common sense applied in an ad hoc way on these topics we're talking about. And maybe that theme is that in with 50 cents transport fares, the right of politics will say, hey, that's a subsidy. You're costing the rest of us. There's no free lunch, so to speak, right? And the same with the free lunches. But then with super, the right won't say that. They'll go, no, no, no. With super, there is a magic money tree and there is a free lunch. This is a special, different type of thing where we should offer tax breaks to everyone because there's something special and magic. Now, my cynical side basically falls back down to well, this is just pure self interest from different groups talking. So, in the context of that, what would be better than super? And what would we do? There's a lot of $1 trillion of assets sitting in special sort of super accounts. What would happen in your view, or what would be best?
Well, I mean, I think the end goal is obviously a universal pension, right? So give people at the moment the pension if you manage to become a homeowner during your working life, then by all accounts the pension is kind of enough to get by,
Mm-hmm.
even if you don't have much other savings, right? But if you don't wind up in that situation, the pension today is inadequate. So we should probably have a pension that is enough, even if you have absolutely nothing and you just need to rent in retirement, then you can survive and not starve. So we should have a pension at least that amount, but we should also give that pension to everyone, because that's just how universalism works, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
even if you're actually quite well off, and you see this when people write into those sort of financial planning agony aunt columns, they'll be quite well off, but they still kind of want the pension, right? Because the pension is this insurance. Obviously there's self-interest involved. People see it as free money, but it's also this kind of insurance policy, right? The social insurance where people like it because they like the idea of having some money coming in that's never going to run out, even if some calamity befell them and all their other, their big house and all their super kind of disappeared, they'd still have this kind of security, right? So even and that's rational, right? That's risk pooling, and that's social insurance, and it helps people. Even if you have plenty of savings, having a pension coming in helps you kind of smooth your consumption and kind of spend a bit more freely without this fear of running out. And so, yeah, I mean that's obviously the end goal. How you get from status quo to that point, even if everyone decided that that's what we wanted to do, I think that's complicated. So you'd have to probably, I don't know if you'd return people's money, or if you would let them keep a super account if they wanted to, but make it optional and allow withdrawals. Um, I think you'd start by getting rid of the tax breaks, but what you do with this sort of
Mm.
$4 trillion pool of wealth. I don't know how you would handle that. And so, I mean, I think it would
Yeah.
be complicated.
No,
But probably,
yeah, I
sorry.
think we're on the same wavelength. Well, we've just got to unwind it and let people like turn super funds into other managed investment funds with no tax advantages, and then just let people get in or out of them if they want. And the money will drain, or people who need cash will cash out, and people who want to keep holding those assets will hold them, and the system will will slowly evaporate. So I guess what do you make of the politics of these? Do you think, just as a final question, so the common theme today was common sense going astray. You've looked at helmet laws, public transport. Why do we have user pays for that and not other things? Superannuation and the like. How does are both sides of politics sort of equally prone to this missing common sense or misguided common sense when it comes to policy, or is there some especially egregious examples from different sides that they seem to rehash, or is it just a mixed bag and kind of a because that's sort of where I end up. It's a bit of a mixed bag. Everyone's got their own little biases and falls back to financial interests a lot of the time, or is there more to it, do you think?
I mean, it's a tough one. I'm certainly on the left side of politics. I'm an egalitarian, so I tend to think that from the right, a lot of the problem is that, you know, if you look at superannuation, all the tax breaks, they might be, they might be government welfare, but they're the type of welfare that the right likes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's they're never going to say anything against it because the status quo works very well for them, and that's just self-interest at play. On the on the on the left side, it gets a little bit more complicated. I think because in Australia we tend to perceive the left as sort of the ALP, but the ALP's ideology, they're not. As I think a lot of people know, they're not a left party in the traditional sense. They're sort of nominally centre left, but I would say that they're kind of they've got I would describe their ideology as uh, labour inclusive capitalism. So they want to get they want to strengthen capitalism, but in a way that brings unions along for the ride, right? And so that puts
Uh-huh.
them in a lot of sort of funny places ideologically because they want to be all things to all people. And I think you see a lot of um, I think you see a lot of common sense stuff from the Greens, but then they also have certain ideas that um, uh, I guess are a little bit irrational. Like if you look at their obsession with student loan relief, for instance, a lot of that seems to be sort of imported from the US because it's a salient topic in the US, and we live in a global political environment, right? Whereas not that it's not an issue here, but it's just not the like in America, you can absolutely have your life uh, absolutely ruined by student debt, but
Mm.
that's not true in the same extent, at least in Australia. Much less, it's much less true here, but the Greens will talk about it a lot, and so I don't know where I don't know where I'm going with this, but
Yeah, no, that's super
um, you know,
interesting. Uh, I think at the end of the day, sometimes we just fall down on the way things are, right? And we just back existing systems. Like when I was writing The Great Housing Hijack, I was looking at the introduction of Medicare, right? And socializing health insurance was a big deal, and the doctors lobbied against it, right? These professions we think are in the business of caring for all of us said, no, we don't want to do more medical services at a lower price. We want to do fewer medical services at a higher price. Please don't require us to work in the public service at all. And please don't sort of expand our numbers and offer these cheap services. So, yeah, I just find it funny that you consider these battles and then we win the battle and then the new normal everyone's kind of fine with in a way. Now the right is kind of still comfortable with it. Everybody's on board. Do you notice that? Like once you get a policy, everyone sort of falls into line. And I think helmet laws are probably a good example of that. Surely there was some discussion, and now everyone's just fallen into line, and no one on any side of politics has anything to say. And probably the freedom lovers are just as, adamant that helmets must be compulsory as sort of authoritarian sort of leaning people. Or am I just overgeneralizing? Am I getting off topic, Robert? Help me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I mean, you've written a book on vested interests, so I think you know how powerful that stuff is. But there's also just a powerful status quo bias at play. And if you think of politicians like Anthony Albanese, I guarantee he spends zero part of his day thinking about helmet laws, right? But he's focused on what's right in front of him, right? He's not thinking abstractly about all these ideas. And maybe if he had a influential advisor or chief of staff who really cared about it and whispered in his ear about helmet law every day, he would change his mind on that. But otherwise, I think politicians are a bit like, instead of coming up with the ideas themselves, they're like corks bobbing in the sea, right? And
Yeah.
it's all about the currents that are around them in terms of ideas. They're not pushing the ideas themselves. They're a lot more passive in terms of policy and in terms of ideology than we give them credit for. They more reflect the consensus of those around them, who are usually insiders and elites, rather than
Mhm.
being abstract thinkers who are sitting at the top of the ivory tower and coming up with ideas themselves.
I think that's a great place to wrap up, Robert, because at Fresh Economic Thinking, I'm trying to put those ideas on the agenda. I hope there's some political advisors listening in today who will think, oh, maybe helmet laws, maybe 50-cent fares or free public transport, or maybe superannuation needs our attention, and can whisper in the ear, and we can ourselves build up that sort of community pressure to put these things back on the agenda. Are there any final words you want to share with us, Robert? I've had a great time listening to your thoughts today. Any last big picture messages for the listeners?
Oh.
No pressure. No call to action there.
I'm coming up empty, Cameron. I think we've talked about all my hobby horses, so I'm the intellectual well is run dry.
This is the problem with us thinkers and wonks, Robert. We don't organize and agitate, and we're not aggressive, and we're not gluing ourselves to things, or we're too in our brains trying to be consistent and thoughtful. So maybe we should all try and be a little bit more active in at least changing the public conversation. And I thank you for your time for coming to do that today. Thanks, mate.
Thanks so much, Cameron. It's been great coming on.